Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Well, the haze shows no sign of abating. It has disrupted classes for over 1 million school students nationwide today. And this is after 1,484 schools in Sarawak, Selangor, Putrajaya, KL, Perak, Penang, Negeri Sembilan all closed for the day. Now, the latest news is that schools in Selangor will be closed for the next 2 days, while schools in Penang and Putrajaya will be closed tomorrow. Sharaad, what do you make of all this?
So the question is, who are you angry at? And I'm sure many of us are, in fact, very angry that we're breathing in a very polluted air. We can't avoid it because you can't be locked up at home because, while the schools are closed, many of us have to go to work. Now,
But there's opportunity cost to this, right? 1 million students, staying home from school, not in classes. That means how many days of school have they missed?
Okay, yes, and I'm sure there are many miserable faces among those little children.
Well, not the children, more
miserable.
About the parents, I would say.
But who are you angry at? Are you angry at the Indonesian government? Are you angry at palm oil plantations? Are you angry at smallholders? Are you angry at this government? Are you angry at ASEAN for failing to deliver on a mechanism that actually works? And I think that's one of the big questions. Who are we directing our anger at, and where can we direct our energies in a way that can be positive despite what seems to be a rather bleak situation?
Is there room for optimism? I mean, are there silver linings to be found amid the haze?
I do think there is room for optimism. There was an initiative, if you remember recently, Broga Hills out in Semenye was on fire, and, many hectares were burning, and people have now rallied around that. Over 1,000 people have said they will help replant those hills. So the sense that people want to do something, I think, is very strong out there. The question at the end of the day is the politics of it, especially when we look at the fact that we've exhausted diplomatic channels and we look at Indonesia and ask ourselves, is the Indonesian president doing enough?
Right. Sometimes it feels like, what can civil society do? Because it just feels like this is a government-to-government initiative. Whether we as consumers, as private citizens, are we empowered to do anything? So you're right, that story about kind of focusing on what's happening within our own borders, with Broga Hills, making sure that we're not adding to the pollution or the air pollution back home. I think that's a silver lining. But I also wanted to say that I saw something quite funny. My silver lining for this has been Malaysians' sense of humor in dealing with the haze. I saw on the music streaming site Spotify that Malaysia has a haze-inspired Spotify list titled Hazed and Confused, and among the songs include The Platters, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes.
Okay, every cloud has a silver lining, but you can't see the clouds at the moment. You can hardly see the KL Twin Towers either.
That's right.
Okay, let's turn our attention to Sabah. Where
developments in politics in Sabah, that's right. So we have recent news that Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has been seen getting cozy with former UMNO antagonist Tan Sri Pandika Amin Mulia and Datuk Sri Saleh Said Kroa. So former antagonists, former, enemies, one might even say, now friends.
Yeah, that along with the story that Sipitang MP Yamani Hafiz Musa, son of the former Chief Minister of Sabah, Musa Aman, has been received into the embrace of Bersatu. Bersatu, of course, is one of the partners of the coalition. If you remember, Dr. Mahathir opened a branch of Bersatu in Kota Kinabalu just a couple of months ago. So there you have two instances. Again, Yamani was famous for going missing after the last general elections. Then he left UMNO to become an independent and now has decided to be part of Bersatu. I wonder what this demonstrates. It either demonstrates, Melissa, one of two things. Malaysian politics is driven by a huge amount of generosity, or, as they say in politics, there are no permanent enemies. There are no permanent enemies in politics.
Right, yeah. I'm just wondering, what this means for the state of Sabah, the optics of it, right? What does this look like to I guess, Sabahans dealing with this? And do politicians even care about optics?
Do they do? Indeed. In fact, there was what's gone viral, an image of Anwar Ibrahim, because party president of PKR, in holding hands on the beach with Pandika Amin Mulia. And of course, there's all kinds of jokes that have been generated as a consequence of this particular meme.
Again, sense of humor of Malaysians.
Wonderful sense of humor. Can the politicians match this in terms of integrity? We know Sabah is famous for describing, or Sabahans are famous for describing their politicians as frogs. Party hopping seems to be a sport in the state of Sabah.
Very quickly, Sharaad, I also want to touch on news coming up from the Middle East. So if anyone interested in Middle East politics, the results of today's elections in Israel should be of great interest. Incumbent Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have failed in his bid to strengthen his hand in the Israeli parliament, or Knesset. And this is despite promises to two extreme Zionist forces, like promising to annex the West Bank. It looks like his party will be in a deadlock with centrist opposition. So why is this interesting?
It's interesting because a lot of Malaysians talk about feeling for the plight of Palestinians, because the plight of Palestinians is crucial to the story. We know Benjamin Netanyahu has been one of the longest-serving Israeli prime ministers in recent times, almost 10 years in power, because he's been dogged by claims that he's corrupt and so on. And so he's holding tight to power. He didn't make it, 5 months ago when they had an election. So he thought by going the low road, he would, in this election, win a decisive victory, at least in terms of controlling the Knesset. It didn't work out. It seems that the two major coalitions are in a dead heat together. And also, interestingly enough, Melissa, the Arab bloc, now this is a grouping of Arab parties, came together, and because of an attempted voter intimidation by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Arab voters, the Arab citizens of Israel came out and voted in huge numbers. Yeah. And now they're the third largest bloc.
That's fascinating. And I think this could be an interesting story to keep our eye on, especially looking at Malaysian coverage of Middle Eastern politics. Do we cover the Middle East sufficiently beyond just the emotive? Okay, after this, we're going to be focusing our attention on the foreign policy of Malaysia in the age of Malaysia Baru. After this, we'll consider this. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me, Sharaad Kuttan. Today, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad launched the Foreign Policy Framework for Malaysia Baru, a living document, he says, which captures the essence of the foreign policy direction of the current administration. Now, joining us on the line to help us better understand this framework, we have Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, the Foreign Minister of Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Datuk. Now, my first question to you is that there's an overarching theme of this framework. It's called change in continuity. Now, what exactly does change in continuity mean for Malaysia's foreign policy?
Well, number one, in foreign policy, you cannot tell people that we have a totally new foreign policy. Then your telephone will not stop ringing. Everybody will ask you, is Palestine still on the agenda? Is Rohingya still on the agenda? Are you going to be pro-West or pro-East and so on? So, as far as our foreign policy is concerned, what is meant by continuity is that the principles, the basic fundamentals of foreign policy, for example, ASEAN remain the cornerstone of our foreign policy. We want to be friendly with all nations. We want to trade with all nations. We remain a member of non-aligned movement. Palestine is always on the agenda. So these basic things will not change. What is then the change? The change is about new approaches. We may have a new focus. We may revisit some old focus and bring a new, new values into it or new elements into it. So, for example, we used to have Look East policy. Now it's Look East policy 2.0. What is another change would be we want to be more proactive in decision-making processes so that, for example, while we are a member of the UN Security Council, we are very active on certain international issues. While we are not, we seem to be not active. Now we are saying, even if we are not a member of the UN Security Council, it does not mean that we would not play as active role as at a time when we are a member of the UN Security Council, and there are many ways of making our voices heard.
Doctor, I want to ask you, the Prime Minister today, when he made the announcement, mentioned Palestine. He also mentioned Jammu and Kashmir, but he did not mention the Uyghurs of China. This signal that in some ways realpolitik will continue to dominate the way Malaysia articulates global issues because we are a small and middling power.
Well, what we are doing is we are looking at cases, at issues case by case. We have been very vocal on the issue of Palestine and Rohingya, yes. Now, even on the issue of Rohingya, we are now saying that 20 years ago, if we were to understand the Rohingya issue properly, or rather, let's put it this way, if we were to understand Rohingya better 20 years ago, we would probably have taken a different approach to the Rohingya issue. What we are doing now is we are treating Rohingya issue just like we treat Palestine, whereas the two are not necessarily the same. And that is why on Jammu, Kashmir, we have a certain way of looking at it, and slightly different than how we treat Rohingya issue.
All right. So in the press conference earlier as well, Dr. Saifuddin, the Prime Minister signaled a consultative approach to developing foreign policy. Can you help us elaborate? What does he mean by this consultative approach?
Okay, there are three things here. Number one, this idea about the new framework, even though it is something that we launched during our time in our administration, but I must tell you, it did not start from zero. Even before, in the previous administration, there was a paper prepared by ISIS. ISIS happened to be one of the institutions under Wisma Putra. Unfortunately, that paper was not given due recognition by the past administration. We look at the paper again. We took a lot of it. Some of the ideas that were launched today came from that paper. And that paper was produced by about 50 who's who in Malaysian foreign policy, former diplomats, former ministers, and so on. Number two, on my part, I formed the Foreign Policy Consultative Council of Wisma Putra. We had thorough discussion on this, and besides that, I conducted town hall meetings and consultation with CSOs, with the youth organization, and so on. And number three, as we implement our foreign policy framework, we will continue engaging with the civil society, with the private sector, and this is what PM meant by we are taking a consultative and participatory approach in the planning and also in the implementation of our foreign policy.
Okay, the last minute we have, Dato', very quickly, critics have noted that Malaysian foreign policy is often shaped by the views of one man, Dr. Mahathir himself, that he has his idiosyncrasies. The fact that he announced it, not you as the foreign minister, was that significant?
Two things here. Number one, many policies are announced by the Prime Minister, number one. Number two, in any country, in most cases, when the head of government and the head of state choose to play an active role in foreign policy, then the head of state or the head of government has a lot of influence on the foreign policy framework, the way it is run in any given country. And this is nothing new. And in my case, I think this is very helpful. It's not You see, in ASEAN, for example, not every head of government or head of state wants to play an active role. The fact that you have the Prime Minister who wants to play an active role, I can tell you it helps a lot, and it gives us a lot of, it opens a lot of windows, especially in the region.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Dr. Saifuddin. Now, joining us on the line, we also have someone from ISIS, from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. We have Bun Negara, who is a senior fellow there. Thank you for joining us today, Bun. I'd like to begin with getting your thoughts again on the overarching theme. This change in continuity, it feels a bit like an oxymoron to me, but what do you think?
Well, the way I read it, it's basically maintaining the broad themes as before, but perhaps with certain tweaks and certain emphases or updates where useful or necessary. For example, major themes like championing the sovereign rights of developing countries, of maintaining ASEAN centrality in regional affairs, of also underlining ASEAN's purpose in the region as a core player in Southeast Asia, and working with any friendly country that is favorably disposed to work with us. These are the I think, central themes that will remain largely unchanged, whereas there may be some changes in, for example, greater focus on issues of foreign policy concern to make, better value for money for Malaysia. As you know, budgeting is a major issue for us now, and also to be more transparent and accountable in terms of foreign policy expenditure. In addition, I think some changes may come in the way of, to be more wary of major power or superpower interests that may not align with ours, and also to be more careful in general about the fallout from major power conflict, whether it's between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and Russia, or between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or among certain Arab countries that may not agree with one another. We should not be drawn into any of this unnecessarily, and we have to actually make stretch our buck to make sure that we get value for money in foreign policy issues.
But if I could ask you precisely about the question of superpower rivalry in the South China Sea, for instance, is there any other way for Malaysia to play this game? It is a game in which China is demanding loyalty from its so-called allies or people it associates with, and America as well. Is there room to maneuver for a country as small as Malaysia?
Yes, but I think a limited room, but still we have to make the most of it. We are a non-aligned country to begin with, and therefore, it's neutrality, but I think more than just neutrality, not passive neutrality, but an active one, in trying to emphasize, I think, the positive aspects of what we can do in being an honest broker between the major powers. I think we should not imagine that we can do very much, but at the same time, we have to do the most that we can. The first thing, I think, is not to be drawn in by one side or the other. Secondly, to emphasize what can be done in a very moderate way that, can help to heal, negative relations among the bigger powers, and also to get the other ASEAN countries as far as possible to work together as one. The U.S. has or had only a couple of allies in the region. Philippines and Thailand in Southeast Asia were the countries where they had a major military bases. And China itself doesn't really have any allies, strictly speaking. Cambodia and Laos have sometimes been called allies, but actually they are not necessarily going to go with China or anyone else all the way either.
But I wonder if we could take a look back, a historical perspective. Now, we mentioned earlier that critics of Dr. Mahathir say that foreign policy has really been dominated by Mahathir's idiosyncrasies. Now, I'm just wondering, what do you think Malaysia foreign policy is going to be like under Dr. Mahathir's second time around, Malaysia Baru, with this framework?
Well, I think this time around there's more inclusiveness in the process. In fact, the new foreign policy framework has been the work of a group of various stakeholders in Malaysia. And it has taken several years to evolve, and it has come to this stage where I think we are in a better position now than before. There's been definitely more inclusiveness than before among Malaysian players and stakeholders. And we have to accept also that whether it's the Prime Minister of a country or the President of a country, the leader actually makes the policy with consultations from the cabinet, in varying degrees, of course, from country to country. But, it is the leader, whether as Prime Minister or President, who makes the ultimate decisions.
All right, thank you so much for speaking with us, Poon. Now, we'll be back with more on Consider This. Stay with us. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Curtin. Now, here's what we want you to consider tonight. The cover of Tempo, an Indonesian magazine, has sparked some debate. If we can pull up the visual, what you'll see is that the cover of Tempo features an illustration of President Jokowi with a shadow of a long-nosed figure, much like Pinocchio. Now, there are some of those who saw this as a form of insult to the president. Sharaad, what do you see?
Well, I do see a complex message in it, because it wasn't a Jokowi with a long nose. If you know the story, of course, in the fable, the young boy, when he tells a lie, his nose grows longer, and therefore this is the fable of Pinocchio, right? In this, it's not that Jokowi is Pinocchio, but that Jokowi is casting possibly, right? And what is at stake here? It's the issue of political promises, right? And so that's the headline front story of
Janji tinggal janji was the headline. So essentially to say that, a sort of to allude that the president has not kept up with his election promises.
So two big questions here. One is, should the powerful have a higher threshold of accepting criticism? And two, is a broken election promise actually a lie, or did it begin in a lie that I knew I couldn't in fact deliver this, but I'm going to put it down on my election manifesto all the same, knowing full well I can't deliver it?
Okay, that's going to be a tough one. Let's tackle the first one too. So how insulated should, the head of an executive, head of state, be to criticisms of all form, including caricature and satire? And my thinking is, the threshold should be very, very high. So the higher you are in office, the thicker the skin you should have, and the more you should be open to criticism of all forms.
Well, that's because, Melisa, you're a Democrat, right?
And a journalist.
And a journalist, and Democrats, and it's very important that you're a journalist too, and I'm a journalist, is that we need those to be accountable, to accept the burden of that, including at times criticism that might be off point, or that might miss the mark, or that might insinuate more than actually is there. The issue for politicians is to explain and to demand a chance to clarify what they have. I think but to enact a law that protects the head of state or an executive or prime minister, whatever it is, from criticism is deeply anti-democratic. It will only lead to things being swept under the rug, and in fact have a chilling effect on the media. I think
the second point, the second question that you raised, Sharaad, is a little bit tricky, I would say. So is not fulfilling election promises considered lying? Now, for me, the answer is no, because the use of the word lying is problematic in a way that we don't know somebody's intentions. It could be a manifesto is an expectation of promises to be fulfilled once in office. However, did you know that you were not able to fulfill those promises? We can never tell the intention of someone making those promises, so therefore calling it lying would be a bit of a problem for me.
It is, but perhaps we need to calibrate what we mean by lies, right? I mean, they're political lies. I mean, these are strategically placed demands on, say, the previous government. And I think that's something the manifesto does. It actually raises ups the ante on the incumbent by saying, we can do this that the previous government couldn't do that. I mean, and without a serious debate about, the conditions under which you would be able to deliver. I do think that it's actually fair to call it a lie.
Okay.
I think it's fair to call it a lie. I think it's important that politicians accept the moral responsibility of not being able to deliver. They can't fob it off by saying, well, the circumstances have changed. It might have, but and therefore I can't fulfill it and be sanguine in that. They have to accept the moral responsibility.
They're going to pay for it for the next election.
Well, they might or might not, but but what's important is they don't haul people to court just because they've said you lied when you said you would be able to deliver so-and-so.
That is something for you to consider. I may not agree with Sharaad, but please think about this, whether you think not fulfilling election promises is considered lying. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kutan. We will catch you same time tomorrow. See you then.